Honorable Patrick E. Higginbotham of the Fifth Circuit, and Professor Hubbard also teaches civil procedure, as well as many other classes here at the law school. So without further ado, everyone please join me in welcoming our two speakers.
Thank you. It's always great to be here at University of Chicago, especially nowadays. Appreciate the commitment to open debate and freedom of expression. In fact, I was just speaking at someone at the National Federal Society office before I came here, and there's a convoy of Yale law students on their way, and they're going to be seeking asylum. So I hope that you all welcome them with open arms. I have this book up on the monitors. It's not actually a book about critical race theory, but it is a book I have forthcoming in July, which is sort of relevant because I wound up reading a lot of critical race theory as part of the book. But in any event, can't come to an event with my book coming out without plugging it, so there it is. So I'm going to start today about critical race theory by explaining what critical race theory is not, because that's gotten very confused in recent public debate. So often you'll hear, well, people who oppose or criticize critical race theory don't want people to be talking about their historical work that uncovers racist patterns and practices that have been overlooked or under-researched. Now, I've written a book that's exactly on those themes. I've written about 12 articles exactly on those themes. The book is called Only One Place of Redress: African Americans, Labor Regulations, and the Courts, from the Civil War, from Reconstruction to the New Deal. It talks about various kinds of labor legislation that had harmful effects on African Americans, often quite implicit in the legislation rather than being overtly racist. And no one's ever accused me of being a critical race theorist or being on the side of critical race theory, which in turn implies that one could be skeptical to or even hostile to critical race theory without being hostile to researching the history of racism in the United States and its current effects. It also follows that one could learn from historical work by critical race theorists, even admire such historical work, without buying into the underlying ideological or theoretical gloss, just as I could hope that they could learn from my work without sharing my libertarian or classical liberal perspective. So by being critical of critical race theory, I'm not suggesting that law professors who identify as critical race theorists don't make important contributions to the scholarly literature, but I do believe that their underlying ideological and methodological framework is wrong. And this is not unique to critical race theory. One could say the same for Freudian psychiatrists, Catholic social theorists, Marxist historians, among others. They may have important insights, uncover unexplored history, raise important issues about justice, even if one believes they're approaching matters from an incorrect perspective, and indeed, even if one believes that their work would be even more valuable if they didn't start with the wrong-headed perspective. So obviously, given all that, I'm not arguing anyone should be banned from discussing critical race theory ideas. I'm fine with critical race theory being taught as a perspective on the world, and at least in the K-12 situation, so long as the ideas are being taught, they're being taught as a perspective subject to the sort of critique I'm giving today, rather than as received truth. So in case this wasn't clear enough, just to reiterate, this is not a personal or attack otherwise on critical race theorists, nor is it suggesting that their scholarship doesn't have value. Instead, I'm going to argue that first, their political ideological perspective is incorrect and indeed toxic, that their underlying theoretical assumptions are mistaken, and that their methodology is problematic at best. Now, obviously, there are a lot of people out in the legal academy and outside the legal academy nowadays who call themselves critical race theorists. This encompasses a very wide range of people. Not every single person, obviously, who's a critical race theorist will agree with everything that I'm attributing to critical race theorists, but this is only like a 25 or so minute talk, so I can't get too much into the weeds, so I am going to be painting with a bit of a broad brush here, but let's just keep in mind that I don't mean to imply that every critical race theory scholar agrees with everything that I'm objecting to. So let's start with political perspective or ideology. While critical race theory has gotten caught up in the culture wars such that the general political left is defending it and the political right is attacking it, critical race theory in its origins, and even today, is primarily squarely aimed at debunking liberalism in general and traditional civil rights liberalism in particular. As an offshoot of critical legal studies, which was explicitly Marxist and anti-liberal, critical race theory shares critical legal studies anti-liberalism. Critical race theory is hostile to such concepts as freedom of speech, the rule of law, meritocracy, and even the goal of having a society that's colorblind, along with other common liberal notions, seeing them all as empty rhetoric that masks underlying power dynamics and are used to justify white supremacy. Now, you could agree with that or disagree with that, but we have to recognize that those notions, those anti-liberal notions, are squarely aimed primarily at liberalism and not conservatism, and that CRT is self-consciously anti-liberal, not much more it is anti-conservative. Now, that may sound like I'm exaggerating, like anyone could come here and tell you anything, so let me actually give you a quote from the book Critical Race Theory and Introduction by Richard Delgado and Gene Stefanchik, who are two of the leading lights, founders of critical race theory. Critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law. So even legal reasoning is suspect from this perspective. Now let's go on to underlying theoretical assumptions. CRT takes certain claims about the world as theoretical assumptions, as fixed givens for further theorizing. But these ought to be treated as empirical hypotheses subject to testing and experience rather than as given truths. And if they were treated as empirical hypotheses, I believe that they would be shown to be wrong. So what are these assumptions I'm talking about? Well, first, there's the idea that all or almost all racial inequality can be explained by the racism, explicit or implicit, conscious or not, of the white majority and or state institutions that operate on their behalf. Put another way, the socioeconomic status of non-whites is primarily attributable to the power relationships they have with the white majority. Now, this flies in the face of the empirical fact that there are greater socioeconomic differences within subgroups of our racial categories that we have in the US than among them. So for example, just looking at the subcategory of African immigrants, we then could break that down. Well, are Somali immigrants and Nigerian immigrants equally successful? No, it turns out that Nigerian Americans have significantly higher income and educational status than do Somali Americans. Indian Americans have the highest income of any ethnic group. Other Asian groups, such as Chinese and Japanese Americans, also have higher than average socioeconomic standing. But other Asian groups, including Bangladeshis, Pamang, Pakistanis, have lower than average socioeconomic status. Again, greater differences within the racial category than among them. There are also vast differences within the white category. The single poorest definable group that people study in the United States, other than Indians living on certain reservations, is probably Appalachian whites. Now, Appalachian whites have been in the United States as long as anybody. They're obviously a member of the white category. They do have this really low socioeconomic status. Jewish and Greek Americans, on the other hand, have well above average education and income. And critical race theory doesn't really have any good way of explaining it, and when they try to, it doesn't really work. If you've ever wondered, for example, why are certain groups talked about as white adjacent, it's because people are trying to fit the square peg of varying degrees of minority success into the round hole of CRT that suggests that such success is only possible if white people have somehow allowed these groups to succeed, have decided not to enforce white supremacy against them, which is a point I'll come back to in a few minutes. Another thing that at least some critical race theorists are very insistent upon is that racial inequality has been transformed over the last 50 years or so, but it has not really lessened. Not all critical race theorists state this, but some do state vociferously. And I say the reason some of this is controversial even within critical race theory is because, frankly, it's absurd, totally contrary to empirical reality. Just to give one example, in 1958, 4%, that's four, like one digit, of Americans approved of interracial marriage. Now in your generation, it's well over 90%, and it's not just people saying that. Interracial marriage is quite common for African Americans. It's gone down from something like 2%, gone up, I should say, from like 2% to over 20% now, and is much higher among Hispanics and Asians. So that's just one empirical example how things have changed for the better, and I could give you lots of other examples, but I just think it's sufficiently self-evident that it's not true that there's been no progress on racial issues in the United States in 50 or 60 years, that it's not really worth spending a lot of time on. Another empirical assumption, or theoretical assumption, that's really an empirical assumption, that CRT scholars make is that racial groups represent collective actors with shared interests and outlooks on the world. This is very similar to me, to my mind, as the traditional Marxist idea that businesses and workers collectively have the same interests as either capitalists or workers. And ironically, this was a real problem for Marxist labor historians, because when confronted with evidence that the American labor union movement had a lot of racism in its history, they just sort of refused. They tried to excuse it, explain it, blame it on the capitalists, because it just didn't make any sense. Well, they're all workers. They can't possibly have any conflicts. So ironically, in that context, it really helped hide racism from public view. For CRT scholars, the notion that racial groups represent collective actors with shared interests and outlooks results in constructs, I should say, like interest convergence, that whites will only support changes that help minorities when whites perceive it to be in their self-interest. This ignores a few things. First, it ignores that whites are not a homogeneous group. And many people who we describe as white in this country don't see themselves primarily as white people. A lot of Jewish people think of themselves, for example, as other. If you're a Muslim or a Christian, your primary identity may be as a Muslim or a Christian, and you may feel that you are obligated by Christian or Muslim teachings to treat everybody the same with equal dignity. Some people who are socialists think of themselves, I'm primarily a socialist. I believe in socialist principles, which of course are contrary, at least in some sorts of socialism, to any sort of racism, because we should have worker solidarity and so forth. Another thing it ignores is that, at least in my view, smart white people will recognize that economic success is not a zero-sum game. In a liberal society where all people are able to reach their full potential, this benefits everybody, majority and minority. I wrote a lengthy blog post on this on the Volokh conspiracy. There was a lot of back and forth with the comments. You can read that post if you're interested, but I think it's self-evident that whatever my narrow immediate self-interest is, in the general self-interest of all people in society, for people to be able to reach their full potential, the wealthier your neighbors are, the more trading partners you have, the wealthier everyone gets. The premise of interest convergence theory, by contrast, is that everything is zero-sum, and that it's actually most of the time in the interest of white people to be racist. Ironically, CRT scholars are not the only ones who do this, but on the left, but they take the same position in a sense as white supremacists do, that it's actually in the interest of white people to be racist because any gains that black people or other minorities get are at the expense of white people. This zero-sum notion, again, strikes me as incorrect from an economic point of view, but it's also undesirable about a claim about the world. Because telling people, hey, racism is in your interest, but don't do it, is a lot less effective than telling people, not only is racism wrong, but it's actually against your interest to do it. And so you're less likely to persuade white people not to be racist. Worse yet, CRT has a strong conspiratorial streak that suggests that somehow whites are making collective decisions about American life. Now, obviously, in the Jim Crow South, whites were making collective decisions through government. But it's not really clear how whites are making these decisions outside of the legal process. So, for example, I mentioned that CRT scholars have a hard time explaining why Indian or Japanese or Chinese Americans are economically successful. So people will say, well, they're white adjacent. And even more so, whites have allowed Asians, at least certain Asians, to succeed. Why? So they could lord it over Latinos and African Americans. They see the Asians succeeding, there's no racism in society, so they allow Asians to rise to the top to better support white supremacy against other groups. Now this raises some fairly obvious questions. How did the white people collectively decide this? Was there some meeting somewhere that I wasn't invited to? When was this decided? Where was this decided? How do they enforce this collective decision that the Chinese people will be allowed to succeed, but Mexican Americans will not? As Professor Dan Farber and Susanna Sherry pointed out back in the 1990s, CRT's conspiratorial streak, I don't think consciously, but nevertheless has some relatively obvious anti-Semitic implications, especially in the field of the legal academy, which I'm in. So back in the 90s, CRT scholars were writing that the way that law schools go about their faculty hiring, for example, is racist and white supremacist, and that's why minorities are underrepresented. When they were saying this, about 30% of law professors at the top 100 law schools were Jews, and Jews had historically faced themselves a lot of discrimination in the academy. So this led to the question, well, if all this is about power relationships and whoever is in charge of things is deciding and they're being white supremacists, are Jews being used by white supremacists somehow? Are the Jews controlling the white supremacists? Are Jews the white supremacists who are keeping minorities out of law school faculties? Finally, critical race theorists often start with the presumption that racial division inevitably will be a permanent part of the American landscape. Just as Marxists believe that there's always going to be conflict between workers and capitalists, similarly, CRT scholars believe the same about race, and oddly enough, not just about, say, African Americans, where there's a 400-plus year history of slavery, Jim Crow, violence, and so forth, but any group they deem non-white, such as Latinos and so forth. But this, again, strikes me as something that flies in the face of the historical reality of the United States, which is that we have a lot of conflicts that once would have been seen as at least equally, if not more, strong in terms of conflict than some of the race conflicts we have now, but that have faded into distant memory. This includes some relatively obscure intergroup fiction, such as Germans versus Scandinavians in the Upper Midwest, but you can read Sinclair Lewis if you want to see that was prevalent even in the 1920s. Clashes between Basque shepherds and ranchers of other ethnicities, also out in the West. But there are also better known antipathies, such as anti-Chinese agitation in the American West, and tensions between ascendant Irish immigrants and the Protestant establishment on the East Coast. Bitter and sometimes violent hostility also took place with regard to religion. Non-Protestant religious groups were targeted. Famously, there was a tremendous amount of anti-Mormon violence in the United States in the 19th century, leading them to flee to Utah. And there was a sufficient antipathy in the 1920s towards Catholics that they were the primary targets of the Ku Klux Klan's major revival in the 1920s. And all of us, including me, are too young to remember this, but it wasn't that long ago, in 1960, that people really doubted whether a Catholic could even be elected president of the United States, and he was only elected. In fact, millions of Protestants who had voted for Eisenhower who had voted for Stevenson refused to vote for Kennedy, but then millions of Catholics who voted for Kennedy who had voted for Eisenhower. So it wound up being something of a wash, but it was a real issue that a lot of Protestants wouldn't vote for someone Catholic. Now we have a Catholic president, Catholic, Speaker of the House, Jewish, Senate Majority Leader. 8 of the 9 Supreme Court justices are either Catholic or Jewish, and really no one even bats an eyebrow. This would have been unthinkable 60 years ago. Because CRT believes racial conflict to be inevitably embedded in American society, rather than encouraging people to transcend racial identity, which is what traditional liberalism would suggest, they actually encourage whites to have white racial consciousness. They believe that there will be a progression from increased white racial consciousness to getting white Americans to acknowledge their white privilege, to white Americans developing a collective critical consciousness that will make them allies in eradicating racism. And after all, what could go wrong with encouraging whites to have racial identity? Well, that's a rhetorical question. I think it's obvious that a lot could go wrong, but you don't have to believe me. There's empirical social science out there that shows that the more white people in the United States have a white racial identity, think of themselves as white people, the more likely they are to be racist, nativist, ethno-nationalist, and so forth. And these are the sorts of ideas that threaten democracy in the United States and elsewhere. And this aspect of CRT, it seems to me, risks being a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you tell white people that they should have white racial consciousness, they're more likely to develop it. And if CRT wins and becomes extremely influential, society will always be divided by race because our educational institutions and popular culture will encourage or even demand that people define themselves by race. Now finally, methodology. CRT has historically been hostile to empirical testing of its theories. It's even been hostile to objective critique because they say only people with a lived experience are able to tell you whether what they believe is true or not. I remember, it's right here on your screen still, even legal reasoning is suspect because it relies on objective argument rather than on subjective epistemology. Only groups that are subject to racism get to define what racism is and whether they have experienced it. People who are not members of the relevant group have no standing to critique any claim of racism. I've seen Jewish scholars who are in the CRT general camp say that only Jewish people get to define what anti-Semitism is, and that makes sense from the CRT perspective because anti-Semitism is a form of racism, but I nevertheless, as a Jewish person who's written a lot about anti-Semitism, if you follow the Volokh conspiracy and otherwise, find this to be kind of absurd. First of all, Jews, like anybody else, can manipulate the definition of anti-Semitism for political purposes. Why not? If you don't like what someone's saying about you, you say, well, you're anti-Semitic, and they have to agree with you then, that's a good way of shutting people down. Second, Jews aren't monolithic. If one Jew says, oh yeah, that's anti-Semitic, and Jew number 2 says that's not anti-Semitic. Well, according to standpoint epistemology, they both have to be right, which is not really possible. And third, and perhaps most important, all claims about the world should be subject to critique, and nothing should be taken at face value when anyone says so. And yet, this is not CRT's position, again, that only the people who are affected by alleged racism are allowed to talk about whether it was racist and how it affected them. And this, to me, is not just fundamentally anti-liberal, it's anti-reason. Now, critical race theorists will potentially argue that they're not the theorists, they're not empiricists. You shouldn't expect them to worry about empirics. They should leave the empirics to others. My own view, and this goes well beyond the issue of critical race theory, is that people who do political philosophy without considering the real world are doing things that are pointless at best. But if we are going to look at abstract theory shorn of empirics, that means we should focus on CRT's normative outlook, which again is profoundly anti-liberal and should be rejected on that basis. Now, I don't think that CRT is hostile to empirics as it once was, in part because it's grown more sophisticated over time, in part because a lot of them do history, which is a form of empirics, even though the plural of anecdote is in data, as we all know. But nevertheless, consider this excerpt from a relatively recent paper from 2014 from 2 professors at top 20 law schools. You can find this. You can actually, if you care who this was or what the paper says, you can actually just Google the quotation. It's on SSRN. Social science research offers critical race theory scholars a useful methodology to advance core CRT claims. Among other things, social science can provide CRT with data and theoretical frameworks to support key empirical claims. So what they're saying here, to get through the academic jargon, is that not that social science research could be used to test CRT claims, but that we know that CRT claims are already correct, and we can then use social science data to prove it. And just in case that wasn't clear, the next paragraph in their abstract is, at the same time, collaboration between CRT and social science risks undermining CRT critiques of objectivity and neutrality, and potentially limits the theory's ability to combat structural forms of racial inequality. CRT scholars can mitigate these risks by choosing social science methods carefully, and by recognizing that social science is only one among several modes of knowledge production. So again, breaking through the academic jargon a little bit, is it says use the sort of social science methodology that you think will help you prove what you already believe, and if that doesn't work, then give up on social science. This is not the way serious social science is done, to say the least. Okay, so to conclude, let me reiterate that even though I have profound disagreements with critical race theory, again, I'm not arguing the work is without value. Lots of people have an underlying ideological or theoretical framework that I disagree with, that nevertheless still allows them to provide valuable insights. CRT, in fact, had one especially valuable insight in the debate they had in the early days with critical legal studies, which is that critical race theorists emphasize that the assertion of abstract legal rights by civil rights activists was actually really important to the victories of the civil rights movement, so that the critical legal studies scholars shouldn't just reject the importance of making rights claims because they think rights are nonsense. The only problem with CRT is that while they're willing to use rights when it's effective, they are very quick to abandon rights as soon as they don't like the outcomes in a given circumstance. So in short, I reject CRT because it's anti-liberal, asserts extremely dubious theoretical assumptions as incontestable baseline truths, and is hostile to objective or empirical critique. And that was my almost conclusion. My real conclusion is that I have one more last criticism of CRT that I sort of tacked on at the last moment, which is actually very important, which is that obviously liberalism in its various manifestations is imperfect, and the C in CRT can sometimes provide us with some profound reasons why we need to question certain liberal assumptions. But it's extremely hard to pin down what sort of non-liberal, non-objective, non-meritocratic legal system that CRT advocates would like. It's one thing to be critical of liberalism, but what is the alternative system that we should contemplate? If racism can't be properly combated and cabined and reduced and limited by liberal procedural justice and colorblind standards and so forth, what's the alternative? What's the desired end state? Is the only just system, I mean, this is something, when at least some of my friends say, it's what you sort of get in the academy, say you sort of get out of the literature, the only just system might be one where the government controls all resources and doles them out proportionally to each racial group. But that in itself, even if that were desirable normatively to begin with, raises all sorts of difficult problems, like how you define what the different racial groups are, which is the subject of my forthcoming book. Once again, classified, The Untold Story of Racial Classification in America, which you can pre-order from Amazon. And moreover, how would you determine within each group how much wealth or resources any individual gets? So, and if you did create something like that, how would you stop that from descending into a Hobbesian war of all against all, given that in that circumstance, where the government is really dictating who gets what and how much, that really is a zero-sum game. And zero-sum games lead to conflict, in my view, precisely because any gain that you get has to come at someone else's expense. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Bernstein, for your comments, for introducing us to many of the concepts. I won't quite agree with your characterization of all of them, but for introducing us to many of the concepts in critical race theory and critiques of those concepts as well. And I'm glad you mentioned your book. I'd actually a little while ago read, I think, one of the papers that was groundwork for your book on racial classifications. So I feel like I'm in a position to endorse his work in this respect and recommend it. So let me begin by saying that Professor Bernstein and I have many points of agreement. There'll be disagreement, I promise, it's coming, but many points of agreement. I won't be able to mention them all, but I do want to note just a couple. So first, I absolutely agree that critical race theory is often misunderstood, and it's important to recognize what it is not. And to be clear, it isn't always easy to define critical race theory. In fact, in less than an hour, I'm going to be making this same point in the class I'm teaching about critical race theory. Because critical race theory can be understood to be many different things depending on the context. Is it a set of ideological and normative commitments? Is it a methodology for legal scholarship? Is it a genre of academic literature that's premised on certain contestable empirical claims about the relationship between law and race? Is it an intellectual movement committed to anti-racist social change? Is it a frame of mind that someone brings to their daily life? Or perhaps is it merely a label attached to works of scholarship or policy that tend to reach a particular type of outcome that we might want to see? And as I said, to different people it may be different things. It may be some of these things or all of these things, or maybe none of these things. I think it's fair to say that Professor Bernstein basically treats critical race theory as an academic legal methodology for purposes of his criticism, and that's how I primarily see it as well. So I think we're on the same page there, and my comments will reflect that view. The other, I guess, point of agreement that I want to mention is that I agree with something that was implicit in Professor Bernstein's remarks, which is, okay, there's a lot of pretty bad critical race theory scholarship out there. And there is plenty of critical race theory scholarship that makes the mistakes, some of the mistakes, maybe many of the mistakes that he points out. But I want to be clear about what I mean when I say that. I also think there's a lot of really lousy law and economics scholarship out there, and that's what I do. I literally, read hundreds of law and economics papers per year, and most of them are just not that good. And it's fair to say also that if you name any school of thought, doesn't matter, there's going to be a ton of lousy scholarship in that school of thought. But, and here's the thing, I love law and economics. It is my bag. I love law and economics, and it's because the good stuff is really good. It's deep, it's transformative of how I think about the law and about human behavior. And I love critical race theory for exactly that reason as well. Now, that's not to say that the best critical race theory work isn't subject to criticism. It absolutely is, just like any other scholarship. And so maybe I should add this third and most important point of agreement with Professor Bernstein, which is that critical race theory deserves to be treated like any other school of thought, with an open but skeptical mind. Okay, so with that, let me touch on some of the key ideas in the talk and offer some points of maybe disagreement or elaboration on them. What does it mean for critical race theory to be anti-liberal? I think it is fair to say that it is anti-liberal, at least in several important senses. And let me say this, I just said I'm a fan of critical race theory. But I should also note that I think, like Professor Bernstein, I am committed to liberalism. I am committed to our current legal order. So how can I be committed to the project of liberalism and also be a fan of critical race theory, which is anti-liberal? Well, it depends on understanding what is meant by critical. And this is a point I think that Professor Bernstein made at the very end. It's also a very important point that I think deserves underlining. It is critical. It looks for weaknesses in the status quo. And most significantly, it attacks the kind of cozy, comfortable stories that we as American lawyers like to tell ourselves about the accomplishments of the civil rights movement and about what the law is capable of, about what the Warren Court's rights-based constitutional jurisprudence has accomplished. It's critical because it pierces that tendency towards self-congratulation that I think lawyers, not just in the center but on the left, have towards what law has accomplished and what it is able to accomplish. Now, to a person like me who sees liberalism and the rule of law not merely as desirable qualities for society, but in fact indispensable to the survival of a just society, such attacks on the current liberal order are not, in my view, damaging to liberalism. Rather, they are essential to its continuing vitality. If the unexamined life is not worth living, then unexamined liberalism is not worth living in. Now, I mentioned the value of liberalism and the legal order. What is the relationship between critical race theory and the rule of law? I will part ways with Professor Bernstein on this point. I do not think that critical race theory is hostile to the rule of law. To the contrary, a core commitment of critical race theory, in fact, one could argue the core commitment of critical race theory, is a demand that we have the rule of law in this country. Let me begin with one of the early precursors to critical race theory, long before critical race theory was even a thing. I'm talking early 20th, late 19th century, Ida B. Wells and her anti-lynching campaign. What was she asking for in that campaign? She was asking that our society follow its own rules. That's the rule of law. That due process be respected when someone is accused of a crime, and that if someone commits murder, that they be answerable for the murders they commit. Neither of those things, of course, occurred in the context of lynchings. The civil rights campaign that culminated in Brown versus Board of Education began by focusing on the fact that the state promised separate but equal. That was the law, separate but equal. But it didn't even deliver that. It delivered separate yes, equal no. Now, that's the past. What about today? Today, the law insists that the state must be colorblind, that judges and courts must be colorblind. And yet every day, probably right now as we speak, somewhere a court is calculating damages in a civil action based on actuarial tables that classify people on the basis of race. So I want to be absolutely clear that in my view, critical race theory, when it criticizes these internal contradictions in the law, it is not hostile to the rule of law. It demands the rule of law that is currently absent. Okay, what else? What else? Now, evidence against the claim that racism is responsible for racial inequality. Now, it is true that racism cannot be the sole explanation for the inequalities that we observe in our society. That's totally fair. But I do want to push back a little bit on some of the evidence of within-group differences, within-group disparities among whites or among people of African origin or Asian or whatever. I see that as kind of neither here nor there. The question is, what's the difference between this racial group and that racial group? The presence of differences within a racial group, be that as they may, doesn't answer the question of why there are differences between racial groups. And in fact, an important theory in critical race theory, again, you don't have to agree with it, and maybe it's wrong, but an important theory in critical race theory, in fact, helps explain the persistence of racism by pointing to exactly these intra-group differences. Appalachian whites. Why would poor whites find their station in society tolerable? Well, it helps if there's somebody else even lower on the totem pole to look down on. That's one of the thesis. That's a thesis of a lot of scholarship by, among others, Derek Bell, who's one of the sort of leading lights in critical race theory. Now, again, that thesis may not be right. It's contestable and is contested, but it very much does account for intra-group differences within races. I agree with Professor Bernstein about his pushback against the claim that there has been no racial progress. I don't actually think this is a claim that is universally, definitely not, maybe not even consistently embraced by critical race theorists, and I think it shouldn't be. I think it shouldn't be. There has been racial progress in the past, and but the one uniform theme I would say that does exist in critical race theory scholarship is that although there has been progress, it has been painstaking, slow, and often reversed. I think that is something that is very much a universally embraced claim. What about the claim that critical race theory says that racial groups have shared interests and outlooks? That's true. That's true. That is very much a common theme in critical race theory scholarship, and yeah, there's something kind of uncomfortable about that claim, right? I think that's totally legitimate. I do want to add a little bit of nuance to what Professor Bernstein said, though, which is that there's a huge emphasis in critical race theory scholarship on the ways in which racial groups are not homogeneous, on the ways in which there are important differences that we must pay attention to within racial groups. There are huge debates within critical race theory about intersectionality, about essentialism versus anti-essentialism, and so on. I guess more importantly, this claim is not a normative claim. Okay, I want to be very clear about that. It's not a claim that it's a good thing that people have or don't have racial identity, that it's a good thing that racial groups have common interest or not. It is a descriptive claim. It is a claim that whether or not you think it's a good thing, it's a thing. It's a thing in the world. And why is it a thing in the world? It's a thing in the world because even though there are countless differences within any racial group, if you are a black person in America, there is one thing you have in common with every other black person in America as just an empirical reality. And that is, you have been treated as black. You have been treated as a category of person, not as an individual. And if that is true, there is at least that common outlook. There is at least that shared interest that binds together a group that is defined by a race that is not entirely of anyone's own choosing. None of us chose, purely of our own volition, the race with which we identify. I also want to add my strong agreement with Professor Bernstein about whether or not race relations is a zero-sum game, or a positive-sum game, or a negative-sum game. I strongly agree that a smart person, white, whatever color, a smart person is going to understand that lifting others up, you lift yourself up too. And that is absolutely right. But the claim made in a lot of critical race theory scholarship about racial tensions and trade-offs between race and competition for status and so on is not making the normative claim that relationships between races should be a zero-sum game, or ought to be a zero-sum game, but rather that they are perceived to be a zero-sum game. And to be clear, some games are zero-sum games. The status competition, for example, not creating wealth through exchange, which I agree is a positive-sum game, and I can't emphasize enough how much I agree with Professor Bernstein about this. But other types of competition are a zero-sum game, like status competition. That is part of the arguments that at least some critical race scholars make about race relations. Yeah, was there some meeting that I wasn't invited to? Professor Bernstein asked. Yeah, I wasn't invited to that meeting either. And that's a good point. Like, what about this sort of conspiratorial tone in some critical race theory scholarship, which I agree is there, and I find it off-putting, to be honest. What about that? Yeah, as Professor Bernstein points out, there were times and places, maybe times and places today as well, where there are, in fact, groups sitting together and talking about, how to maintain white supremacy. But to be very clear, one of the main themes in critical race theory is structural racism. And the point of structural racism is there doesn't need to be any command and control apparatus for racism to operate in society. Maybe there was in the past and there isn't today, but that doesn't mean that there won't be racism occurring, even if every single one of us has the best of intentions and acts in a completely colorblind way. Perhaps, especially if each of us acts in a colorblind way. In other words, white supremacy isn't just about the bad intentions of some racist, white supremacist cabal that is running society that may or may not exist. It's about everyday life and how everyday life is impacted by a long history of racial subordination, whether intended or not. That brings me, I guess, to this question about the permanence of racism. Yeah, and this, this is a point of agreement. It is a widely held view advocated by Derek Bell, whom I mentioned earlier, as well as others, that racism is a permanent feature of American life. That is a disturbing claim, and to be clear, a controversial claim, and a claim that may, it's an empirical claim. It may turn out to be true, it may turn out to be false. Only time will tell, ultimately, of course. But I do think it is fair to say that there are plenty of reasons based on social science and history that the time when racism comes to an end in this country will be a long time coming. Now, how am I doing for time? Oh gosh, okay, I better wrap it up. Let me just say something about social science, since I'm an economist and I like to think about social science. I agree that critical race theory in the past, and to some extent today, is skeptical of quantitative empirical social science. I'm not a fan of that skepticism. I am a huge believer in the value of quantitative empirical social science. But I will say this: some of the types of critiques that critical race theorists and other critical theorists have made about social science and about the concepts of objectivity and so on are valuable critiques, and critiques of that nature have in fact improved, I think, in my view, vastly the quality of quantitative empirical research in the social sciences and economics in particular. After all, the critical project is largely about exposing the invisible assumptions underlying a system of thought, exposing the assumptions, the things that are taken for granted, bringing them into the light and saying, is this really what we believe? And the credibility revolution in empirical economics was really about that same idea, recognizing that there were unstated assumptions that were driving the methodologies that were used to generate empirical results, and in some cases, debunking them. Not always, but sometimes. Now, I mentioned objectivity. One of the most unsettling critiques raised by critical scholars is their critique of the notion of objectivity itself. Now, I want to be clear to avoid misunderstandings. This can be misunderstood as an attack on the idea that objective truth exists. Now, that is a debate that also I assume exists. I'm not a philosopher, so I won't even attempt to touch that debate. I am happy to assume, and in fact I do believe, that objective truth does exist. But the claim is different. The attack on objectivity being made in this context of critiquing the law is different. The claim is not that objective truth doesn't exist, but that an objective person doesn't exist. That none of us are objective, all of us are subjective. We each have our own viewpoint, our own assumptions, our own commitments, and our own values. And these assumptions and values affect how we see the world. And if we insist on objectivity, that we are being objective in our approach, we are not making the quality of our analysis better. We are making it worse because we are choosing to be blind to the assumptions and the values and the commitments that may be affecting the judgments that we make. And as an economist, one of the things that has vastly improved the quality of empirical economics over the last quarter century has been the incredible amount of self-scrutiny that empirical economists have engaged in terms of what are the assumptions that we are actually making when we run this regression. Now, I'm not here to talk about regressions, I'm here to talk about critical race theory, but I want to make the point that that degree of scrutiny is essential, whether we are talking about liberalism, critical race theory, or social science. With that, thank you very much for listening to my remarks. Thank you very much, especially to Professor Bernstein for leading this very invigorating discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I'd rather leave time for questions than say a lot. I agree with a fair amount of what was just said. If I was giving a longer talk or writing a long article, there'd be caveats and so forth on some of these issues. I do think, the one thing I do want to mention is I do think the idea of being more critical of things that are just accepted without thinking about them as being okay is something that I definitely agree with. I don't think one needs to be a critical race theorist to do that, even with regard to racial issues, but it's welcome when one does that. The one anecdote that I could give is that I was a law student in your position. I was extremely uncomfortable with the idea of clerking for a federal judge because it was the height of the drug war, and I thought the drug war was doing tremendous damage to the country, and particularly to inner cities and members of minority communities. And I didn't want to be a cog in the wheel of the drug war, but whenever I raised this with anybody, they just looked at me like I was nuts, and that there was really no line on your resume for could have clerked for the Ninth Circuit. I didn't want to be a cog in the drug war, so I could have just sort of went along with it. But so I just wanted. I'll just let it be open for questions rather than go on. Thanks.
So just please feel free to raise your hand, and then we'll call on people, and then we'll begin.
Thank you both. The striking thing to me about the last 45 minutes is that it's like a totally different world discursively from the way critical race theory is talked about outside of this room. And I'm not sure which of you this question should be addressed to, but in a way that is a point of frustration for me, because it seems almost like futile that we have this interesting conversation right now that has illuminating aspects, but it kind of doesn't matter because the way critical race theory will be operationalized outside of this discussion will generate more heat than light. And it's not clear that it's really about generating light. So is critical race theory the term a contribution? Is it social effects? Is its negative social effects in causing so much tension worth the academic benefits that we just got? Or would we be better off just disaggregating the quote-unquote theory and just taking each claim one at a time. So that's kind of a question about what you think would be better for society outside of this room, even if this room is mature enough to have a conversation about critical race theory, because I'm really skeptical that the rest of the society is sufficiently mature. And that makes me worry that people are aggregating these claims, which are interesting on their own, into the term critical race theory in order to make people angry, not to really have any other effect.
I mean, I would never tell anybody who's an academic, well, I shouldn't say never, because there's always exceptions, but I would rarely tell anybody who's an academic to write or not write about things that they think are important or interesting because of how they fear will be used or misused in public discourse. But I think we have to keep a couple of things in mind about critical race theory. The first is, even though that we're primarily familiar with it as legal scholarship, and the advantage of it being a legal scholarship is that the legal academy still tends to be pretty rigorous, and there are all these internal debates. It gets both utilized in other academic fields that are more politicized, and that's saying something because law is still somewhat politicized. The more politicized, where there's less ideological, where there's much more ideological cohesion, and therefore less likely to have really questionable claims challenged. And then you go a further step, and you have popularizers like Ibram Kendi, who are very vague and ambiguous, but if they're ever sort of pinned down, where you get this stuff from. Because, well, you know, I've been influenced by critical race theory, and a lot of things that Kendi, I mean, I've written about Kendi, so I mean, some of you may be familiar with his work and love him, but I think it's just, you know, garbage, at least the popularized versions of it. I haven't read the full academic version, but the version that my middle schooler was assigned in school, which is why I read it, is just complete garbage history and pernicious ideology. And it's the kind of thing that if you presented it to any decent law school faculty, you would never get a position there. So, and that winds up filtering down, and you know, they're not going to be assigning you know, Kimberly Crenshaw's original writings or Derek Bell or other critical race theorists in middle school. Are going to be assigning Kendi, and that becomes, like I said, so then when people say, oh, well, how dare you criticize, you know, you shouldn't criticize Kendi, you're criticizing critical race theory, then the conservative side, or the people who don't like what the kids are learning, say, oh, critical race theory is bad, and that becomes the, you know, so we do have this distinction between the serious academic work, which is, you know, still has the problems I addressed, but is at least, you know, does make a lot of contributions, and levels down. Again, one level down is less serious academics who just are hooking onto it without really knowing what they're talking about, and then in other fields, and then the popularizers, and then it filters down to your middle schools, which becomes a culture war issue, which is where I started my talk. So that's how I think about it.
Anyone else?
Professor Bernstein, you talked about sort of the dangers in sort of your terminology of a rise in sort of white racial identification, and that has been associated with high racist incidents. And you sort of say that this is what you pointed to work that indicates that connection in the past, and said that this is what will happen if CRT predominates. But if it doesn't predominate right now, I guess my question is, where does that increase in white racial identification come from, external to CRT in your understanding?
That's an interesting question, and you know, this is getting a little bit beyond my own knowledge as a law professor rather than a social scientist who studies public opinion. But it's not clear to me. I mean, there is my understanding, which again, forgive me, I'm speaking a little bit outside my expertise. My understanding is that the rise of what we see as white nationalism in the United States in the last decade or so is less of a product of there being more white nationalists and more a product of two separate phenomena. One phenomenon is that it's a lot easier for white nationalists to find each other, right? They used to meet sort of surreptitiously in Motel 6 conference rooms, handing out badly typed flyers on the street, and now they have Twitter and chat groups and all that, and it's a lot easier to find each other and they can be more organized. And the second thing that is really an under-discussed fact is that before 2008, before the Obama election to president, the percentage of people who social scientists identified as white racists in each party was basically equivalent. It was small, but it was like 5% Democrats and 5% Republicans were people who were white and racist. What happened in 2008 is, not surprisingly, when the Democrats nominate someone who is African American, all the racists in the Democratic Party give up on the Democrats and move to the Republicans. And at the same time, whites who are liberal on race, even if they may be conservative on economics, well, they think this is the greatest, this is a great triumph, and they're very excited by Obama. And a lot of them move to the Democrats. So the Democrat Party suddenly becomes even more racially liberal than it was, and the Republican Party, now actually, instead of having 5%, has like 10%, which starts to become a reasonably significant constituency. I would say that, and which Trump, I don't really understand Trump's appeal to begin with, or how he ever figured out how he could become president. I don't think he ever thought he would become president, but somehow he intuited that one could sort of play footsie with them without explicitly endorsing them, and make that enough part of the Republican coalition to defeat what was the blue wall and all that stuff. So a short answer is that I don't know that we really have had an increase in like white identitarianism, as opposed to them being more organized and all concentrated in one political party. But the second answer is, I'm not sure that it's completely counterfactual to say that the more people have to check off a box every time they do anything in life and check off the white box, the more likely it is that people will think of themselves as white. We have two really interesting countervailing sociological phenomena, which in some sense the law and some norms are pushing you towards racial identity, which is you're checking off boxes all the time. Schools have there are affinity groups at work, affinity groups at school for different groups. On the other hand, people have been becoming intellectually more racially tolerant, and intermarriage among different groups is really high, to the extent that it's really hard to be an identitarian if you have one Filipino grandparent, one Irish grandparent, one Native American grandparent, and one Cuban grandparent, right? Well, what's your identity? Which of those is your identity? One thing, I'll just say one more thing. There's all this really interesting sociology literature, again, outside my expertise, about what we're developing in the United States. And one possibility is we're developing a multiracial, purely American identity, which may or may not be interfered with by identitarianism. Another possibility, they say, is that there's going to be that all the groups that aren't black are going to become like the majority, and African Americans will still be in the minority. And one is that we will somehow continue with it being whites versus everyone else, in terms of everyone else considering themselves minorities. There's a fair amount of literature that just as of pretty recent, like Latinos are basically becoming a less distinct group in terms of their political ideology and so forth, that upper middle class Latinos look very similar politically to upper middle class whites, depending on geography and all that. Anyway, it's all a very interesting question, but the question is, I think if I were someone who is sympathetic to critical race theory, I would ask myself what are the odds that if we encourage people to, and I'll tell you, I've been thinking about this for over 30 years, because Derek Bell gave the he was like the featured speaker at the 100th anniversary of the Yale Law Journal's banquet. And he told an anecdote which really stuck in my mind, which is that he had a student in his class who was a young Jewish woman, and she told him at the end of the semester, "Professor Bell, I really want to thank you, because before your class, I just thought of myself as, sort of nothing, I'm just like Jewish, whatever, but now I look down and I see my skin and I see I'm a white person. I think of myself now as white." And I was thinking, is that really a good thing? The rationale for being a good thing is then you become aware of the privileges, and you become aware of ways that race is used to marginalize other people. But is in the longer run, Do we benefit from people thinking of themselves as white people, or thinking of themselves, oh, I'm just whatever, some other identity I have, and not as, in race? And I think, interestingly enough, there's this whole separate issue, whole separate literature on whiteness from historians and whatnot. And basically, if I was coming to University of Chicago giving this talk 70 years ago, maybe 50 years ago, maybe 30 years ago, well, not 30 years, 50 years ago, 70 years ago, 100 years ago, many of you would have been thinking, there's a Jewish guy standing up there. There's a lot of Jewish professors here. Maybe we have too many, or maybe if you're Jewish, you're like, why don't we have more because they're keeping us out, or whatever. But that would have been what you've seen as my identity. Now we've got to the point where people see Italians, Jews, Greeks, Irish, they just see them as regular white people for the most part, and there's a lot less ethnic discrimination in the United States now. There's no barriers. Should that be the goal in general? Not that people can't have their identity. I'm still a Jewish person. I go to synagogue, but people, that's not define my life outside. Now, I don't know, but certainly that's something to think about. That I think there's this idea, well, that can't possibly happen to people who have dark skin, or especially people of African descent. And I'm more optimistic than that. And I think it can. I guess if you think it can't, then you're more likely to think that if it's going to be racial oppression regardless, then maybe we need to make white people aware of their privilege. But if you think it's, hey, maybe it's actually possible we could transcend race, if not next year, if not in a decade, if not 20 years, within our lifetimes perhaps, then maybe you want to de-emphasize that.
Can I just add a couple of small things to these comments? I do think it's a really important discussion. There's a lot. And Professor Bernstein's raised a lot of really big points in that respect. I'll just say two things. So one is with respect to the connection between the teachings and the popularity of critical race theory and identification and white racial identitarianism. Just as a matter of, I think, uncontroversial historical fact, the idea of a white racial identity long precedes the critical race theory. So it's certainly not creating that white racial identity. And as Professor Bernstein points out, it's not even clear that this concept of a greater sense of self-identification as a white nationalist or the like is necessarily even increasing over time. So I think those are both good points that are touched on by Professor Bernstein. The other thing I want to mention, though, is related to that anecdote from Derek Bell, which is I think one of the things that critical race theory tries to bring forward is this idea that if you say to yourself, no, I don't have a racial identity, I'm just a person, right? You're missing something, because in this society today, if you have a neutral identity, that identity is not race neutral. That is a white identity. And by making one aware of racial identity, one isn't adding to a person a sense of whiteness. One is simply making one aware that the race neutral identity that is attached to what it means to be American is itself raced, and it is raced as white. So I think whether you agree with that or not, that is the way that critical race theory would explain why what they're doing isn't creating a white racial identity, but simply pointing it out, something that's already there. All right, thank you.
Please get outside. Please join us tomorrow when we welcome Judge Porter.